Hi, this is Mike Tierney of Data Not Distress, and in this video I'd like to answer the question, did virus avoidance strategies make the 1918 Spanish flu as deadly as it was? The 1918 Spanish flu pandemic was the deadliest of all modern pandemics, killing 17 to 50 million people from February 1918 to April 1920. One of the interesting factors of the Spanish flu, as it is known today, is that viruses were too small to see with the microscopes of the day, so people were not even aware that viruses existed. What they were able to find in patients back then to link the entire pandemic together was Bacillus influenzae, the bacteria of influenza, which was believed to be the cause of influenza until the 1930s. Some recent research found that most of the Spanish flu deaths were, as diagnosed at the time, due to these bacterial superinfections, which themselves can be exacerbated by any illness weakening the body. So, it is possible that deaths attributed over 2 entire years to the Spanish flu could have been from a wide range of illnesses that result in pneumonia, including coronavirus colds, etc. Bacterial infections require close quarters with other infected individuals, almost like in the famous photos of open-air warehouses filled with beds in which patients would cough up into the air and all over other patients. As patients died of the bacterial infection they got at the hospital, those newly empty beds would be filled with new patients suffering from cold or flu, who otherwise would have recovered at home in a week or so, only to be infected with bacteria from the patients next to them that would make them sicker and eventually kill them, thus opening up that bed for the next patient. The first wave of the 1918 pandemic, in March to June 1918, traditionally cold season, caused only a mild elevation in what was reported as flu-related deaths. The second wave, in September to December, traditionally flu season, saw deaths at a level that could easily be described as a different disease, and strangely seemed to affect young people more than the usually vulnerable old. The third wave was from January to June 1919, again traditionally cold season, and behaved differently than the second wave, closer in deadliness to the first wave, only slightly more so. A fourth wave, again more minor and in cold season, was seen in some places in January to March 1920. A few preserved samples from the most deadly and therefore most studied second wave were later positively identified as having an influenza virus infection. However, given that bacteria was the presumed cause throughout this time, and the reason we think of these 2 entire years as one pandemic event is because of the way it was recorded and taught, one possible view of these different waves is that each was driven by a different disease. A cold, the identified flu, a cold, and then a cold in turn. We then assumed that they were all the same disease, both because it was similarly bad throughout this period, and because that was the prevailing view after most of the dying were found to have the same bacteria by the microscopes they had available at that time. But what if other factors led to a series of bad airborne diseases over those 2 years? It is possible that the first 1918 season's bad cold set off a wave of virus avoidance behavior in communities, which was then fully enforced by the second wave. If people were frightened into believing that there was a super illness going around, particularly in younger individuals who hadn't seen bad cold seasons before, they would feel that the thing to do was to crowd into hospitals for treatment, where they would then be exposed to the bacterial infection that would kill them. Interestingly, China was hit by this second wave flu, but for them it was a mild season, and they did not experience the level of deaths seen elsewhere around the world, suggesting that even that second wave flu was just an ordinary flu, with nothing special about it except the virus avoidance behavior of much of the world in dealing with it. The virus avoidance culture and associated hysteria driving people to the hospital then began to dissipate after the third bad cold wave, leading to less impactful airborne disease. As always, there would be many contributing factors to overall health results. Another possible contributor to the deadliness in 1918 was the level of pollution in a newly industrialized world. This was decades prior to emission controls, and it was difficult to see across the street in many cities across the United States. So, there was likely a much larger vulnerable population to respiratory disease worldwide back then, similar to what we see in COVID-19 deaths in countries like Thailand with high levels of pollution. It is difficult to know for sure what had happened in the past, particularly when all the types of evidence we might consider today were not available back then. But one thing is for sure: when human observation is the lens through which an event is seen, it is always helpful to question whether the prevailing view is built upon a chain of misconceptions. While there are many reasons why humans are often incapable of admitting mistakes, one of the biggest indicators that the response to the Spanish flu was considered to be a failure by those who lived through it was in survivors of the Spanish flu, who led the response to pandemics several times more deadly than COVID-19 in the 1950s and 1960s, who rejected virus avoidance strategies.